Thank you very much for coming out tonight. My name's Joe Morehouse. I'm the chair of the Ringwood Society. I don't want to go on too much, but I will just give a little plug to Ringwood Society in general. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't do that. We've been going a long time, or the Society has, since the demolition of a particularly lovely building in the marketplace in 1962. And ever since then, we've been promoting good conservation and good design in Ringwood. For example, recently we were consulted about the railings in West Street, which we were able to preserve and make sure they were sympathetically restored rather than being dragged out and off by highways. We always monitor and comment on planning policies and planning applications. At the moment, members are very much involved in the neighbourhood plan, which is quite an exciting project to give a lot more control to our local, to the local people of Ringwood in terms of planning, rather than it being devolved to district level. I'll just say a few words about our speaker tonight, Mary, who I've learnt a lot from. Like me, not born in Ringwood, not born and bred, but she's been here for at least 50 years, a lot longer than I have, and been a long-standing member of the Ringwood Society, previous chair, in fact, and has been really seriously looking into the history of Ringwood since the 70s.
80s.
And you might see her writing in the Ringwood Roundabout magazine, the Now and Then.
Well, thank you, Joe. And my first job has got to be to thank Joe. He is, as he explained, the current chairman. He's a professional, he's an architect, and what a professional job he's done in producing the exhibition. The things that I used to put on in the past pale in significance compared with this really impressive array of photographs, which Joe, as he said, has been out on his bicycle with a little help from Jeff, taking all the photos. And you know how quickly Ringwood changes. So he's got one last month and then thought, oops, we better change that. They've just changed their name and out he's gone. And this is pretty hot off the press. But even so, I think we're still going to be behind on one or two because Ringwood's forever changing, as you know. So well done. I really want to congratulate you, Joe. We start off with a map of Ringwood from 1897, but Joe has blocked in all the listed buildings that were up at that time. And there are 114, I believe, altogether. And you'll be glad to know I'm not going to be talking about all 114, otherwise we'll be here all night. I've just picked out my choice. You may be disappointed if I've missed out your favourite one, but here we go. The buildings' descriptions are in the little boxes on the display, and they come from historic England. It's what they have described as the buildings. And I think that was done quite a long time ago. The first ones were 1964, and some of them were redone in 1987. And I don't know who it was, but I don't think it was anybody from Ringwood. And I think they just went round and looked at them from the outside. So I actually dispute some of the datings and details they put in those little boxes. And because since 1987, actually, over 30 years ago, I went on a course at Friars led by a very distinguished mentor, Jude James, who taught us, including Ted Baker, if those who remember Ted, how to look at read old documents, look at primary sources, and that's what I've used over the years with my research. So I've done it for 30 years. I can't remember everything by any means, but it's there at the back of my mind, and I've had to dig it out and try and find some of the details from deeds, wills, newspapers of the day, censuses, and of course I have used secondary sources as well. But you can't always rely on something just because it's on the internet or in a book. Doesn't necessarily mean it's absolutely gospel. In fact, I don't think the Gospels were always completely true. Joe's already referred to the Hampshire Pevner Buildings of England. This is the Bible for architects. Nicholas Pevner was a gentleman in the 1960s who went round and went to every single parish in Ringwood, in England, which is a tremendous feat, and wrote about it all. And this has been updated again in 2018. So I will be referring a little bit to some of the comments. Mr. Pevner is dead now, but the man who did it in 2018 was called Bruce Bailey. And I was honoured to be able to go round with him a bit and put him right on one or two things. As far as I know, the only mistake he's made is he's got the date of the Railings outside Greyfriars as 2012, and it was 1998, but he got his Jubilees mixed up. He got his Greyfriars Jubilee mixed up with the Queen's Jubilee. But originally, he thought they were, he put it in that they were original, and of course they're not. So, but other than that, that is something I will be referring to. When I say Pevner, it's this book I'm talking about. Now, Pevner always starts off with the ecclesiastical buildings in the parish, so I'll follow his lead and do the same. You'll all recognise this. It's the Parish Church, of course, which is Grade 2 star listed. There are 4 Grade 2 star listed buildings in Ringwood, and we're talking about the whole parish of Ringwood, by the way, in this talk. And this is one of them. I'm not going to describe the church because you've all seen it and you can go in there, and I'm sure people from the church will be able to tell you a lot more than I can. So, but there has been a church here ever since Saxon times, because it's mentioned in the Domesday Book. There's a church and a mill. So if there was a church and a mill in Domesday, there must have been people living here in Saxon times to have built the first church and the first mill. In Victorian times. So what you see now is a Victorian rebuild, but it was rebuilt in the same form as the previous church, so a cruciform church, and it did take a lot of materials and features and monuments from the old church and put them into the new church. So a good example of recycling by the Victorians there. The actual wall round the churchyard has its own listing, and it's interesting to see that this bottom bit of the wall is it looks to me like an ironstone, and that looks like the original height of the wall. And then as burials have taken place over 1,000 years, the level of the earth has risen. So that's always a good sign to show if it's on an old site. And if you see the church, which is often built on a bit of a rise in the ground anyway, but the ground level, if it's gone up with people buried over there, then they've had to put the wall up. I just pointed out this is just part of the wall, and you may have noticed this in the wall. I don't know if you've ever looked at it closely and know what it is, but in 1812, George Rose, who was the MP for Christchurch, passed the Roses Act, which required throughout England all parishes to keep a metal safe in which to keep the registers and the marriage, birth, deaths and marriage registers in more detail. Before it was just up to the vicar or the parish clerk to write whatever he thought, But by 1812, they had more of a form which they had to fill in and be more accurate, and they had to keep it somewhere safe. So Ringwood was very good. They obeyed straight away. Ringwood Parish, 1813, it says on it. But it would have been kept in the church. And if you go to Sopley Church, you'll still see they've got their one in the church. I don't know when that was put in the wall. Anyone tell me? Possibly when the church was rebuilt, I don't know. But it was now set in the wall, and it's no longer of any use. I think possibly at one time they had a gap in it for putting money in, but that's been blocked up. But it reads, John Hawtrey, Vicar, Stephen Ailes, Joseph Biddlecombe, Church Waddens. Whoever cast that iron safe missed out the R out of church wardens. But there we are, his mistake's still there. 200 years later, we can still see it and remember their names. Anyone know where this is? Yeah, yes, good. Yes, people pointing upwards, good. Look up. Always look up when you're looking at buildings, by the way. It's always... that's just a little trick of Joe's just to get you looking round, right? The second ecclesiastical building is the Meeting House, which of course we're sitting in. Another Grade 2 star listed building, and quite rightly listed with a star because of the pews that you're sitting in. Built in 1727, it was built for a group of Presbyterians, not Quakers. It was never Quaker, which is a misconception. This was a group of what was called dissenters, on nonconformists who didn't agree with the way that the Church of England was run. They didn't like bishops and formal things, but they did want to come and have a meeting. They didn't call them services, they didn't call them churches, they called them houses. So it's an 18th century term, which is not just for Quakers, it was all denominations of Baptists and Quakers and Presbyterians and others. And here we are, that was you lot a few years ago. Actually last year, wasn't it? Wasn't that long ago? Yes, obviously the listing was because of the interior. You are in a building that is 300 years old, almost, and in pretty much its original state. Obviously there's changes, but the layout of the pews, the way they're arranged, is how they would have been in the 18th century. So as such, it's certainly the best in Hampshire, best example of a meeting house, and it's recognised as being nationally one of the best in the country. So it does merit its Grade 2 star. The other buildings, religious buildings with Grade 2 listings, are Trinity Church, that was built in 1866, Palmer Baptist Chapel, 1840, St Paul's, Biston, 1842. So what a range of different architectural styles we've got there, but all worthy of listing, I think you'll agree. Now on, I'm looking at Norman here, but now on to Biston Manor House. We haven't got any stately homes in Ringwood as such, because that's what would come next if you were sort of going down the list as Pevner did. But Biston has a very long entry in the Pevner book. And I would argue of all the larger houses in Ringwood, Biston has got to be the oldest in anything like its original state. The manor has only ever belonged to 4 families since 1349. So it's got a hell of a long history. It's been owned by the Bettisthorns, the Barclays, Comptons, and the Mills family since 1792. The central part is believed to have been built in 1520, so that's Tudor period. And there's partly Tudor, partly Jacobean, with some doings going on in Victorian times as well. All these buildings, no building ever stays the same. It's got to be repaired, mended, changed with the fashion. But basically what you're looking at there, I would say, is a sort of Elizabethan, Jacobean style building. 2 wings were added by the Comptons in 1652, and they've got their date on there and their heraldry. And actually, Biston Manor is, as you probably all know, is a private house still owned by the Mills family. But there is an open day for Heritage Open Days on the 10th and the 13th of September. But, and there's a big but, you have to book. And I think if you haven't booked already, you're probably too late. But and I won't be around, so I'm not going. I have been in there, and say that has got to be, in my opinion, Ringwood's oldest big building. The other manor in Ringwood, of course, is the manor of Ringwood. And the manor house, the central bit of the manor house, is grade 2 star. I'm not exactly sure why that should have a star and Biston Manor shouldn't, but there we are, that's the fact that it has. This was not quite as straightforward as Biston Manor, which obviously had families living in there. This did not belong to, it belonged to the Lord of the Manor, but it wasn't ever lived in by the Lord of the Manor of Ringwood. The Morant family lived in Brockenhurst. So the Lord of the Manor of Ringwood, since 1792, or same time as the Biston, the estate changed hands, was bought by the Morants, and they live in Brockenhurst. And you probably know that Mr. Morant, President Mr. Morant, still owns the rights to the market charter. But he doesn't own property in Ringwood anymore, or very little. But this house was not lived in by the Morants when it was built. There's, again, probably an earlier house on this site, which belonged to the Line family, and they were a very influential family in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, faded out a bit in the 18th century. But that name Line does crop up for various places and various people. And they did own the manor of Laybrook, which was over to the west of Ringwood, in the bit that's now Dorset. It was acquired in the 18th century by John James Manfield, who was a local lawyer, and it was probably him who rebuilt it. The date of 1737 is on the drain pipe, and that fits on with the time he was there. And his eldest son, James Manfield, who later changed the name to Mansfield, put an S in it, was one of our eminent people. He was a lawyer, and he rose to great heights and went up to London and eventually became Lord Chancellor. James's brother, Richard Fezard Mansfield, carried on in the manor house, and William Mansfield lived in Mansfield House. So that's why we seem to have got this name. And we've got Mansfield Road, and those new houses they're building behind Mansfield House are now called Mansfield Gardens. So if you wonder, it's nothing to do with the town of Mansfield up north, it's to do with this lawyer, who should not be confused with another one who became the first Earl of Mansfield, who's a completely different character. In 1792, the Morants purchased the Manor of Ringwood, and this was one of the houses that came with them. And they obviously thought it would make a good house as a dower house for Mr. John Morant's mother, Lady Caroline Morant. So she moved in the 1850s along with her son, Hay, Richard Morant, and lived there and occupied. So the Morant family lived there from 1859 to 1913. So that's when it was called the Manor House. That's when it got its name, the Manor House, in Victorian times, because of the connection with the Lord of the Manor of Brockenhurst. Now, there's a date that keeps coming up that I might refer to again. 1916 is when the Morants were forced to sell most of their property in Ringwood. That was very common during the First World War all over the country. Death duties and all sorts of problems meant that a lot of these estates were sold off. And the Manor House, and this is, the side ones are listed separately. I'm talking really about the whole house now, was sold off and came into the hands of Admiral Egerton, and then followed by his son, Admiral Brian Egerton, who died in 1972. And the house then was left empty. I wasn't in Ringwood Society at the time, but I was interested in what was going to happen to it, and I'm sure the society were worried too. It was empty for a long time. And I remember I went to the auction sale in 78, and was very relieved to find that it was bought by someone who wanted not to knock it down, but to renovate it, split it into three as it is now. And I will just mention the coach, I call it the coach house, the stables, can't remember Kingsbury's it's called now at the moment. This is a particularly nice building that is also listed, and that was the stable block and the coach house for the Manor House. It wasn't ever a school, as somebody thought the other day when they were looking at exhibition. Just because it's got the cupola on the top doesn't mean to say it was a school. Pevner actually says in his book, the former stables are a lovely job, mid-18th century, rather grander than the house. Obviously, you can see where it's been filled in, but that central gateway is big enough for a coach and horses to get through. But I can't help thinking that it can't have been just stables with these Venetian windows here. I don't think any I think they must have been further at the back. I think maybe these ones were possibly a state office. But I can't ever remember it as anything but offices since I've been in Ringwood. Oh, one more thing, which I haven't got and that's all right, I haven't got a slide for this because I just meant to mention there is one more manor of Ringwood, which I haven't got a slide for because there was no manor house. It was the Manor of Ringwood Rectory. And that was the church land, the glebe land. And it's all dotted around Ringwood. There's no rhyme or reason to it as far as I can see. And that belonged to the church lands. And Ringwood Rectory Manor, the rectors of Ringwood the rectorship of Ringwood was given to King's College, Cambridge by Henry VI back in the 15th century to give so that the tithe money from Ringwood helped to build King's College, Cambridge, which, as you know, is a beautiful chapel there. So I will only mention that because I will be referring back to it. But there's no manor house. I suppose you could have said the vicarage was the manor house, but the vicarage got changed, obviously got rebuilt over and over and over again. Used to be at the west end of the church, but got demolished finally, completely, the last version of it, when they built the first bypass in the 1930s. Right, so we go on to the grand houses, I would say now. And top of my list here, I've put Moortown House, which is hidden away down Christchurch Road behind that wall. But as you see, a very nice example of an 18th century house built mid-1700s by the Line family again. But it was part of Ringwood Manor. I've found a newspaper article of the time where this house was put up for auction in 1775 to pay for John Lyne's creditors, so he obviously had overstretched himself. And there was a lot of farmland that went with it. It wasn't just a house, there was a lot of farms that went with it. Charles Farm, one of the ones still going. And in this advert, it was described as a capital mansion house, courts, garden, orchard, stable, malt house, barn, rick house, and 12 acres of arable land. In the Victorian times, it was occupied by several people. They must have leased it from the Lord of the Manor. One of them was Henry Brockner, JP. It's that sort of country squire gentleman type. Another was John Coventry, who went on to go up to Burgate House in Fordingbridge. And I'm sure there were other hunting, shooting and fishing type of gentlemen that lived there, and very nice it must have been for them too. The wing on the right-hand side and the bay windows were added sometime late 19th century, about 1900. But again, this is another one that got sold by the Morants in 1916. We've got the catalogue and the description of it all then, as an attractive and a picturesque old country residence. And the occupier at that time was the Reverend A. Pennington. In the 20th century, the single-storey addition on the right there was added, which is called the ballroom. And it's designed in the style of Edwin Lutyens, the famous 20th century lawyer. architect. But apparently, according to Pevner, the architect was actually Horace Farquharson, if you've ever heard of him. And the garden's also laid out in a sort of Gertrude Jekyll sort of way. Beautiful. And I think we've got some lucky people here tonight who live there now. It's been, since 1980s, it's been turned into 8 apartments. Earlier in the 20th century, it was occupied by a solicitor and an antique dealer. And I think those eagles on the gate as you go in are something to do with him. And this is probably old Ringwood gossip, but I think there were goings on at that time. But I don't know any gory details you'll be upset to hear. I don't know, but that's what I was told a long time ago, but they probably didn't go into details to me. Next we come on to Greyfriars. Now you must all know that because that's in such a prominent position, literally on Christ Church Road and figuratively as the heart of Ringwood's community centre. It's described by Pevner as the showpiece of Ringwood's houses. It was built around 1783, so late-ish Georgian, by Mary London, who was a member of the Goss family, and she actually built it for her and gave it to her niece, a lady called Mary Field, who was the daughter of Alexander Carter. I know all this because I've seen the deeds of Greyfriars, and it's quite explicit that Mary pulled down an older house on that site. Lately, it says in the deeds of 1783, lately erected this house. The lucky lady Mary Field was actually married to a London corn merchant, so she didn't. This must have been a second house for her, and very nice too. But it was soon sold off to her. She sold it to her brother. She didn't give it to him. She sold it to her brother, Alexander Carter II, in 1790. And they lived there until they moved to Bridge House, more of that later. And then in 1824, it was finally sold off to another admiral, Admiral Edwards, and then his son Richard. So it's always been a private residence up until it became the community centre. One bit of interest that we found out in the 1891 census, it turned out that Mrs. Baden Powell was resident there, mother of Lord Baden Powell, the Scout movement. Nobody had remembered that at all. She's not in the deeds because she could only lease it, was only there renting it for a season or two, I suppose, but there she was in the census. So whether Baden Powell ever visited it, I don't know, but possibly not, because I think in 1891 he was out in South Africa. In 1920 it was sold to the Christie family, and they were the last family to live there as a private residence until Hilary Christie sold it to the newly formed Ringwood Community Association in 1959. On to another house, quite similar, I think, to Greyfriars, but this is Grade 2 star listed. And my question is why? Why, as Greyfriars, which is Pevner says is the showpiece of Ringwood houses, only gets Grade 2? Why does Bridge House get Grade 2 star? I don't know. It's a lovely house, but not as lovely as Greyfriars, I don't think. I say it was built by Alexander Carter in 1806, and again the deeds are all in the record office, and it's quite categoric that he pulled down. He inherited this from his father-in-law, who had the brewery next door, and it categorically says in 1806 that he pulled down his father-in-law's house and built that. So the details over there, when they say it's 18th century, i.e. 1700s, has got to be wrong, except that possibly I would suggest that the door frame is exceptionally good, and it could be that he went in for a little bit of recycling and kept his father-in-law's door, the door frame, but built the rest of it out of brick. It then, of course, you probably remember, in the 20th century, it became the Bridge House Hotel for a long time. And it's actually where I stayed on my honeymoon. That's how I first came to Ringwood. In 1970, many years ago. And we liked Ringwood so much, we decided to come and live here. Then after that it became Armfield Limited for a long time until quite recently. And it's been sold now, a bit of a mystery, that house at the moment. Nothing seems to be going on that you can see, there's nothing. But I believe it's round the back, the offices that are built at the back are CAM Construction. But I haven't heard anything about them there. They've kept themselves very quiet, they don't advertise. Another beautiful house, early 18th century, probably Queen Anne, actually. Built, again, I've got documentary evidence, and looking at the land tax assessments in the Record Office, I believe this was built by a family of Quakers called Messer. By the mid-1700s, it became into the hands of the Goss family, who were much more known about them. And we've actually got a portrait of William Goss up there, over there. William and his wife Elizabeth, they lived in Netherbrook House in the 18th century. William was a clothier, which is where you made all your money in 18th century Ringwood. But the bottom of that fell out the market when the Industrial Revolution started, and the Goss family fell on hard times and had to sell out. And by the end of the 1700s, they were gone downhill badly. And William's son and heir was up living in London in a sort of tenant in sort of digs. Very sad ending to the Gosses. The house was built by the family of lawyers called Oakes, and later on, Victorian times, there was a Major General Anderson living there, and he installed the fireplace that's inside. If you've ever been inside, it's a wonderful fireplace depicting all the generals' wars and battles and careers. It's been an antique shop since the 1960s, and that was when the bow windows were put in. They are not Georgian. They were put into the antique shop. Right, now we move on to inns. Everybody loves talking about pubs and inns, and you would expect all old inns to have to be listed and have ghost stories or what have you, and the original White Hart doesn't disappoint. I would pretty sure, I can't prove it, but I'm pretty certain that this is probably holds the title of Ringwood's oldest inn. It's right there in the marketplace, which is where Ringwood grew up, started, near the church and near the river. Some of it, I think, could date well back. Now, there is this legend that was put about by a Victorian landlord that it's the original White Hart because it got its name by Henry VII, who out hunting in the forest came back to Ringwood with a white hart, put a gold crown around its neck, and got the inn changed, the White Hart in its honour. Well, that's a load of rubbish, because the White Hart was a symbol of Richard II, who's much, much earlier, it's 14th century, and there are inns up in London and elsewhere that date back that far. So it's nothing to, and Ringwood's not even claiming to be Richard II. So, and I could buy that Henry VII came past because he would have been hunting, and he would have been going to Canford Manor because his mother lived there. Whether he had a white hart with a gold crown, I doubt, because that's a legend that goes right back into classical mythology and Alexander the Great and what have you. So I think that's just a little bit of marketing to make it the original White Hart. But it worked, and it stuck, and people are impressed by it. So sorry to disillusion you. It was Ringwood's coaching inn, and in 1784, the mail coach left for London every Monday and Thursday evening. Later on, that moved, the mail coach moved to the Crown at the Friday's Cross. But it was definitely an important coaching inn. In the 19th century, there were 3 generations of the Travers family running it. And in 1860s, it was, again, John Travers ran out of money and sold it to Mr. Morant. So it became part of the Manor of Ringwood. And it was a tenant, Edward Lowe, that took it on at that time. And it was him that got this legend and got it all printed up and advertised as the original White Hart. And he also altered the facade. Inside, you've got those really big old fireplaces that could be centuries and centuries old. But otherwise, it had a Georgian front, because we have got a little sketch of it. But this was altered in Victorian times. And what was the archway was given this pointed Gothic mock Tudor look. That's all pure Victorian. The date over the door is 1868, is the date that it was all remodelled. Again, it's one that got sold in 1916, when Mr. Morant forced to sell off most of his property, and it was bought by Eldridge Pope, the brewers, which is now Marston's, as you probably know. And I mentioned the Crown as the other major coaching inn. The third coaching inn was, now I'm calling this the Red Lion, because that's what it was for at least 200 years, probably a lot longer. But in recent years, it's become Finn McCall's, and then Finn's, and then the Noisy Lobster. It was the third coaching inn, but not as good as the White Hart or the Crown. It was never a male coaching, and it was tended to be used more for wagons and carriers. And in the courtyard at the back, there is a house which has been called which I think the present owner has called the Coach House, but I think it was a brew house myself. The landlord of the time was reported as providing homemade stingo, that's strong beer, reduced in price and increased in strength. So he was definitely brewing on the premises. And next to that, old Ringwoods will remember there was a monkey cage with a monkey in it. I expect some people, put your hands up if you remember the monkey. Yeah, there's some people. Oh, only one? I think Tony does. Yeah, I think Tony does. Yeah. There's some place we've been keeping our eye on as a society, because it's been empty for quite a while. It's now owned currently by the Hayward family since the 1990s. And it was turned into an Irish pub in the 1990s. But this is the bit in the picture that is the listed. The house next door, which is 27 Marketplace, is also has been part of the Red Lion, but it wasn't originally. So this is the bit that's listed in the picture. And I think Peter Hayward has just very recently got his planning permission to do something with the house on the right, build in the back on what he calls the Coach House, and turn the original pub. I don't think it's going to be a pub again. I think watch this space with that. But I think it'll be flats at the top, and I'm not sure exactly what his plans are for the ground floor. But that's the sort of thing Ringwood Society keeps our eye on. That's one of Joe's hot off the press, took it yesterday type of. So that's where the roofs come off. He's got his planning permission. He's working on it as we speak. Well, not literally, but. Now you might say, well, that's a social club, that's not an inn. But the right-hand side was originally. It was another one of these jobbies that to Alexander Carter, having pulled down his father-in-law's house and built his own house, he also pulled down the pub that was there, called the Wagon and Horses, and built that bit on the right-hand side, which was called the Antelope. And it was a pub until the 1880s, after which it was privately occupied. It may be, by that time, the only Miss Carter Alexander Carter had died, was his sister, Miss Carter, Sarah Carter, who was living in the house. And she, strangely for a brewer, owner of a brewery, was a Temperance supporter. So she was sort of fighting against herself there. So that was privately owned after the pub closed down. In the meantime, this house, which was private, a completely separate house, had older, obviously, with a Dutch gables feature. That had been privately owned until in the 1900s it became the Albany Temperance Hotel. And after World War I, it became the Comrades Club, later the British Legion, and now all part the Social Club own both of these. Again, It's a property that's been worrying us, and I'm sure many of you. Still not quite sure what's happening there. They've demolished all the new bits at the back, which we're not too concerned with. Quite pleased to see all those bits going. But these two houses together are listed, and they have, as you see, been done up and are in the process of being done up. And I was told by the builders that the intention is still to keep it as a social club, with other people being allowed to come in and as a pub. But whether that's going to work, I'm not. Watch this space. Haven't got time, we'll be here all day if I go into all of them, but the 6 other pubs in Ringwood, the Fish, the Elm Tree, the White Hart Pounder, the Inn on the Furlong, which is one of the most recent listing. Yeah, that's got to be a recent listing. That's a very recent listing. The Crown Tap and the Crown, I know it's not the Crown anymore, but I put it in there as well. And it's become Walks Thai restaurant. I haven't got time to go into them, but they're all listed. Shops. Put this one in because this is another one that's been empty-ish for a while and was worrying us. Again, it's owned by Peter Hayward, who owned the Red Lion. And fortunately, that's been let to Anna, who's spent a lot of money on the property, and there's now a bridal shop. But those bow windows are original Georgian. It's the only shop in Ringwood that has the original Georgian bow windows. And you can see they're a bit wonky. They have been bashed into and broken at times, so there's been a lot of repair. But basically, they've been looking like that for over 200 years. And it was an ironmonger's for over 200 years. And many of you will remember Rose and Alexander's. Some of you even remember Rose's, just Rose's. But Percy Rose, who was there in the 50s, his father was an apprentice in 1863, and he took over in 1878, and he was there till his death in 1933, when he was well into his 80s. And it's recorded in his obituary that whilst every other business house has been structurally altered, yet that which he occupied is identically the same as when he first entered them about 70 years ago. So it's down to Henry Rose we've got to thank for not changing his shop front and leaving us with this. Percy Rose died in 1951, and it became Rose and Alexander's, and it should have a plaque on it, actually, because I used to work there. Put this one in quickly, because this is now two shops, William Guy and the new, still to be opened, hasn't taken its time, the Kitchen and Bathroom Company. Obviously, till recently, Goldsby's. That's what it looked like 100 years ago when it was in the Morant 1916 sale. It all belonged to the property of the Lord of the Manor. And at that time, it was Olif's Tea Rooms, the Ringwood Supply Stores, a private house, and something else. Quite remember who was in the other one. So was it 4 houses or was it 2? I'd argue, I don't know, but I think basically it was built as 2 houses. You've got 3 windows up there and 3 windows. On the right hand, you've got the lovely 6-paned sash windows. And they've all now got different shop fronts of various styles. Quite attractive, actually. Those ones have been there since in the picture I just shown you. But you can just see where the top of the keystones of the original windows were. So that wouldn't be allowed now to start bashing things like that up. But do look up and notice the chimney, because that's got to be the largest chimney in Ringwood. It's huge. And it's got the 2 fireplaces, matching fireplaces, one in William Guy's and one in the bathroom shop, which is going to look really nice when they do it out as a kitchen. Some people have said it's the largest in Hampshire, but I couldn't prove that because I don't know Hampshire well enough to have looked at every single chimney in Hampshire, but I reckon it's certainly the biggest in Ringwood. One more shop, just put this one in because, again, this has just changed hands as Nudo. Not quite sure how long that will last for Ringwood, but we shall see. Fridays, the wine bar didn't last very long, but this is something that many of you remember it as Hex, the jewellers, for many years, and it was George Hex that put the clock up on the first floor, and Ringwood Society was part of the struggle back in about 3 years ago, trying to get that clock mended. We normally support conservation officers in the NFDC. On the whole, we're keen to support things, but we really opposed them because they were trying to they were insisting that it had to be done mechanically, and it would have to be wound up from the inside, as it all, which was quite unreasonable because that's let out as a flat, and you can't expect somebody to do that. So finally, after a lot of badgering and protesting, and the owner of the whole building, Chris Wood, did a bit of crowdfunding and managed to get... And the Ringwood Town Council were extremely supportive. In the end, overruled the conservation people, and the clock is now fully mechanised and working, which is what we want. So that's a good job done. Farmhouses. Now, Joe has this ambitious thing of including all the properties in Ringwood, including Powner and Biston, and I'm not so familiar with all those little farms dotted about, and I didn't feel confident in going into great detail about them, but I am confident about going into this one, because this is Southend House at the bottom Hightown Road, and this has got to be my favourite house in Ringwood, and the one that I've done a lot of research on. It was owned for a long time in the 20th century by the Minty family. And I was a great friend of Mrs. Fry, who was a Miss Minty. And she was very helpful to me and told me all sorts of things. And I've never met anyone who's been so accurate. A lot of people will tell you stories, and then when you go away, you think, and when you check out, they've got it mixed up. She was absolutely spot on everything she ever told me. And she could tell me things right back to the beginning of the 19th century. She obviously got on well with her father and her father's father, and she knew lots and lots of things, and everything she ever told me all checked out. I could have spent the whole evening telling you about this house because there's all sorts of interesting things about a lost letter found mouse chewed up in the attic that dated from 1780 something. Lots of connections with Newfoundland, which is something again that interests me. But it was part of the manor of Ringwood Rectory. That's what I was telling you about earlier. That's why. And although I haven't been able to go to Winchester and do a lot of research into the manor of Ringwood itself, the Ringwood Manor, I have done a lot of research into the manor of Ringwood Rectory because it's much smaller. The snag is all the deeds and all the documents are all at King's College, Cambridge. When I started going into this, the archives were only opened by some old Don who was there on a Tuesday afternoon, if you were lucky, if there was an hour in the month, and didn't really like women. So I didn't stand a chance. But a friend of mine, who was in our study group, did get to Cambridge, got in, met this old chap, and photographed the survey of the manor. And from it, I've been able to pick up the story of this house. The first survey, which was all in Latin, which I can't read medieval Latin, my Latin's slight, but it was a first survey when King Henry VI had passed it over to King's College. They wanted to know a bit like the Domesday Book, they wanted to know what they'd got, and they did a survey in Latin, but it was translated for me by Anthony Light from Fordingbridge, not to be confused with Tony White, Anthony Light, and it stated that Richard Harris holds a messuage with 7 acres of arable, 1 acre of meadow, 1 close called Slabmoors, and 5 acres of meadow in Southmead. So that was a starting point, right? Now from that, you wouldn't know what you were talking about. But the good thing was that this name Harris's stuck, and it went through all the surveys until they come to 1768 one, which was in English, and it said, one messuage commonly called Harris's, now a large, well-built house containing 6 rooms on a floor with a yard, outbuildings and a garden called Southend. And it was held on what was called copyhold from the Ringwood Rectory by a family called Clarks, who were the same people that did Clark's almshouses. And William Clark was very, very involved in here. And so it was a big tie-up, somebody I actually knew and heard of that was in that house. And really it was his brother that was there most of the time, I think Thomas Clark. And that was a farmhouse. It wasn't just the house and the gardens. It had lands. In Clark's time, held lands which now included the Castleman Way estate, you know, all the Euston Grove and Victoria, whatever, and Waterloo Place and all those houses down what was the railway yard. The cemetery, the junior school, College Road, my road, Kingsfield, Woodstock Lane, the Quamp and School Lane were all part of this farmhouse. So my argument is, although the definition over there is saying something like 18th century, it goes back much, much further. And I think that's true of so much in Ringwood, that other than Mr. Carter, who seemed to be delighted in pulling things down and starting from scratch, everybody else just adapted things, each generation. That house would not have looked like that in 1448. It would have been a wattle and daub with a thatch and a much lower roof, a cat slide thatched roof probably. And you can see on the side of it where it's been raised in the 18th century, which has been added on in the 18th century, probably by the Clarks. And this mouse-eaten letter was found in that part of the attic by what Mrs. Fry used to call the new part. She died over 20 years ago, nearly 30 years ago now, nearly, unfortunately. And the house has been sold off, and the yew tree gardens has been built in the gardens. But that house is just recently been sold again, and they've been working on the roof at the moment and putting in skylights at the back, which we thought was perfectly acceptable. The mock Tudor, if you like, on the front has got to be, not quite sure who did that, but probably about 1900 that was probably put on. It would never have been allowed to have been added now, because it doesn't look right. The railings, they're listed in their own right because they are particularly nice and fortunately didn't get taken away during the war. And Mrs. Fry told me that they came off a Victorian yacht. And when I say that, I mean a really posh yacht, you know. And if she said that, then I believed her. But I can't tell you any more about which yacht it was, but they are glorious, and they've just been repainted. Now we're moving out of the middle of the town. This has gone up to Eastfield Lane. This is Poplar Farmhouse. And there again, it's got a slate roof, looks, what would you say, early Victorian perhaps, or possibly 18th century. But Joe's been inside this, and it's much, much older than what they say on the listings. It's clearly timber framed originally, and that's a cruck construction, which is, dates it back to possibly the 1400s, yeah. And it has been recently sold, and the people there were very keen for Joe to come and tell them all about it. Again, it was part of the Manor of Ringwood. It was in the Morant sale of 1916. It was then known as Lower Hightown Farmhouse. But it's a much earlier date, originally the heart of it, than the Historic England's description. Another one, anyone recognise this one? It's on the main Southampton Road. On the left as you go up to Pownner. This is Pownner Lane Farmhouse. Pownner Lane's the old name for Southampton Road. And it's also, I believe it was part of the Ringwood Manor again. But this is just another example of a farmhouse that you can see in the gable end there, a much older bit with herringbone brick infill and timber framed, so much older than the front. It's very, very common that people did up the front of the house and, the back, go round the back and look at the back, because it's often there you can see the older bit. That's true of so many cottages in Ringwood. Haven't got time to go into all these, but I thought we'd show you some pretty thatched cottages, which quite rightly are listed. And they're dotted all around Ringwood. This little one here is down at Biston, and I've never seen it, but Joe found it. It's well off the beaten track. And I don't think it's got anybody in it, has it? No. Don't know what's happening with that. They've got Biston Schoolhouse there. Old cottage you'll recognise in the middle. But the others are all dotted around Powner and Hightown, or Coxton Lane. Right, I'm sorry, but I haven't got time and I don't know. So if you want more information on some of those cottages, ask Joe, because he knows more about them than I do. Because he got invited in and given cups of tea by all the people. And so this, just to remind you that it's not just buildings that can be listed. The Jubilee Lamp is listed on its own right, standing in the marketplace, obviously, was built by public subscription in 1887 to mark Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. And it became, by 1977, it was in a dreadful state, those of you who can remember it. The lamps had all gone. There was one electric lamp on the top. This bit here used to be a water fountains, and that was all filled in with concrete. There was a public conveniences sign post stuck on it. It looked absolutely dreadful, but it was to celebrate the present Queen's Silver Jubilee, which is going back a bit now, 1977. I think it was the Round Table that took on the job of restoring it, and it's been restored again since then. When the High Street, the marketplace, was enhanced. And it's now considered one of the features of Ringwood. It was not made locally. People thought it was Armfields, but it wasn't, because when they uncovered the base of it, cast on it was G. Smith of Glasgow. And I saw that with my own eyes. Unfortunately, I didn't take a photograph of it. So unless you dig it all up again, you'll have to take my word for that. But I saw that with my own eyes. And other things that have been listed: with the War Memorial, and that's just had its 100th birthday. The old bridge, the second bridge. The milestones, the stone milestones, there's one or two of them. These are just examples. A barn, that barn's, where's that? Where? Cowpits up at Powner. That is a medieval coffin lid in the churchyard. Can't tell you anything about who's under it or whether there is anybody under it, but it is a medieval coffin lid. And that's the barn up at Aveley, isn't it, Crow? So that's my potted sort of round robin, quick whiz round Ringwood. And I'll just finish with what I consider I've chosen as my most unusual building, perhaps, to talk about. Alum and Sidaway. Now, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but there may be some people here that walked past that, looked in the jewellery shop, but have never really looked at it closely and never gone down Lines Lane and looked at this bit. And you should do, because when I first came to Ringwood, I looked at that building and I thought, that's strange, that's weird. I know I've seen a picture of that somewhere. Now, where the hell have I seen it? And it was in Ringwood Library. I don't suppose it's there now, because it's back in the 70s. That was the picture I saw that was in Ringwood Library, and we've got pictures of it here. It's the same building. But look where it is, in the marketplace, right in front of, well, that says the Red Lion. That was the George before it got rebuilt. but in front of what's now the breast cancer charity shop and the other charity shops that are there. Very close in. And it was built in the 1734 or 43, seems to vary, as the market house. Belonged to part of Ringwood Manor, where the courts were held in those rooms above, and the market stalls were put under the arches. Now, all sort of market towns tend to have these, and you can still see some of them dotted around the country. But by 1860s, people were tired of it. They said it was making this street too narrow. They didn't like kids kicking balls and playing games up against the side there. I expect the people in those shops there objected, or houses. So in 1867, it was taken down, and when Mr. Morant decided to build his new town hall, now the old cinema, and moved up to the corner of Lyons Lane and rebuilt using, now I'm sure it's not all the original bricks and everything, but certainly it's the original stone dressings. You've got the columns either side, and the stone around the windows, the pediment. That little round window's new, but it's a copy of what was in the marketplace. So it's one of Ringwood's sort of quirky things, and a good example that recycling, we might think it's a modern thing, but it isn't. It's been going on for centuries. And I'm very pleased that they did do that and not just carted it all away, because we've got it still to admire. Unfortunately, you can't see it very well because the other building, which isn't great, is it? That 1960s building next to it, which is now a dress shop, isn't it? Was Mostyn's for a long time. You can't really get a good stand away and admire it. But that's my last example of my most unusual little feature of Ringwood to look out for. And I suggest, when you go around Ringwood, do look out for the insurance marks on the buildings on the first floor. Look out for the dates on buildings and the chimneys. They're all what gives Ringwood its character. And so I've written about a lot of these buildings. If I haven't mentioned your favourite one, if you go on Google Roundabout Ringwood mags and you go onto the site and you flick down to Now and Then, a lot of the things I've written about are online. So that's Roundabout Ringwood. And the current owner, it's sold now, and the current owners aren't keeping up. So you've just got to get the copy, which I think there are some here, if you're lucky. And also, go on to Ringwood Society website, and if you want to ask a question that I haven't covered, just jot something down there, or possibly see me afterwards. Right, thank you. I think that's good time. Yeah, 9 o'clock.